of the three empires. 801,000. After the decline of Harsha's empire in the 7th century, a number of large states arose in North India, the Deccan and South India. Unlike the Gupta and Harsha's empire in North India, none of the other kingdoms in North India were able to bring the entire Ganga Valley under its control. The Ganga Valley with its population and other resources was the basis on which the Gupta rulers and Harsha had been able to extend their control over Gujarat, which, with its rich seaports and manufacturers, was important for overseas trade. Malwa and Rajasthan were the essential links between the Ganga Valley and Gujarat. This defined the geographical limits of an empire in North India. In South India, the Cholas were able to bring the Krishna, Godavari and the Kaveri deltas under their control. This was the basis of their supremacy in South India. Large states arose in North India and the Deccan between AD 750 and 1000. These were the Pala Empire, which dominated eastern India till the middle of the 9th century, the Pratihara Empire, which dominated western India and the upper Gangetic Valley till the middle of the 10th century, and the Rashtrakuta Empire, which dominated the Deccan and also controlled territories in North and South India at various times. Each of these empires, although they fought among themselves, provided stable conditions of life over large areas, extended agriculture, built ponds and canals, and gave patronage to arts and letters, including temples. Of the three, the Rashtrakuta Empire lasted the longest. It was not only the most powerful empire of the time, but also acted as a bridge between North and South India in economic as well as in cultural matters. The struggle for domination in North India, the Palas. The period following the death of Harsha was a period of political confusion. For some time, Lalitaditya, the ruler of Kashmir, brought the Punjab under his control and even controlled Kannauj, which, since the days of Harsha, was considered the symbol of the sovereignty of North India, a position which Delhi was to acquire later. Control of Kannauj also implied control of the upper Gangetic Valley and its rich resources in trade and agriculture. Lalitaditya even invaded Bengal or God and killed its reigning king. But his power waned with the rise of the Palas and the Gujara Pratiharas. The Palas and the Pratiharas clashed with each other for the control of the area extending from Banaras to South Bihar, which again had rich resources and well-developed imperial traditions. The Pratiharas also clashed with the Rashtrakutas of the Deccan. The Pala Empire was founded by Gopala, probably in AD 750 when he was elected king by the notable men of the area to end the anarchy prevailing there. Gopala was not born in a high, much less a royal family, his father probably being a soldier. He unified Bengal under his control, and even brought Magad, Bihar, under his control. Gopala was succeeded in AD 770 by his son, Dharmapala, who ruled till AD 810. His reign was marked by a tripartite struggle between the Palas, the Pratiharas and the Rashtrakutas for the control of Kannauj and North India. The Pratihara ruler advanced upon God, Bengal, but before a decision could be taken, the Pratihara ruler was defeated by the Rashtrakuta ruler, Dhruva, and was forced to seek refuge in the deserts of Rajasthan. Dhruva then returned to the Deccan. This left the field free for Dharmapala, who occupied Kannauj and held a grand darbar which was attended by vassal rulers from Punjab, eastern Rajasthan, etc. We are told that the rule of Dharmapala extended up to the furthest limit of India. In the northwest and, perhaps, included Malwa and Berar. Apparently, this implied that the rulers of these areas accepted the suzerainty of Dharmapala. The triumphal career of Dharmapala may be placed between AD 790 and 800. Dharmapala could not, however, consolidate his power in North India. The Pratihara power revived under Nagbata too. Dharmapala fell back, but was defeated near Monjaya. Bihar and modern East Uttar Pradesh remained a bone of contention between the Palas and the Pratiharas. However, Bihar, in addition to Bengal, remained under the control of the Palas for most of the time. Failure in the north compelled the Pala rulers to turn their energies in other directions. Devpala, the son of Dharmapala, who succeeded to the throne in AD 810 and ruled for 40 years, extended his control over Pragajyotishpur, Assam, and parts of Odisha. Probably a part of modern Nepal was also brought under Pala suzerainty. Thus, for about 100 years, from the middle of the 8th to the middle of the 9th century, the Pala rulers dominated eastern India. For some time, their control extended up to Varanasi. Their power is attested to by an Arab merchant, Suleiman, who visited India in the middle of the 9th century, and wrote an account of it. He calls the Pala kingdom Ruma, or Dharm, short for Dharmapala, and says that the Pala ruler was at war with his neighbors, the Pratiharas and the Rashtrakutas, but his troops were more numerous than his adversaries. He tells us that it was customary for the Pala king to be accompanied by a force of 50,000 elephants, and that 15,000 men in his army were employed in fulling and washing clothes. Even if these figures may be exaggerated, we can assume that the Palas had a large military force at their disposal. But we do not know whether they had a large standing army, or whether their forces consisted largely of feudal levies. Information about the Palas is also provided to us by Tibetan chronicles, although these were written in the 17th century. According to these, the Pala rulers were great patrons of Buddhist learning and religion. The Nalanda University, which had been famous all over the eastern world, was revived by Dharmapala, and 200 villages were set apart for meeting its expenses. He also founded the Vikramshila University, which became second only to Nalanda in fame. It was located on the top of a hill, on the banks of the Ganga in Magadh, amidst pleasant surroundings. The Palas built many viharas in which a large number of Buddhist monks lived. The Pala rulers also had close cultural relations with Tibet. The noted Buddhist scholars, Santarakshita and Deepankara, called Atisa, were invited to Tibet, and they introduced a new form of Buddhism there. As a result, many Tibetan Buddhists flocked to the universities of Nalanda and Vikramshila for study. Although the Palas were supporters of Buddhism, they also extended their patronage to Saivism and Vaishnavism. They gave grants to large numbers of Brahmins from North India who flocked to Bengal. Their settlements helped in the extension of cultivation in the area, and the transformation of many pastoralists and food gatherers to settle down to cultivation. The growing prosperity of Bengal helped in extending trade and cultural contacts with countries of Southeast Asia, Burma, Malaya, Java, Sumatra, etc. The trade with Southeast Asia was very profitable and added greatly to the prosperity of the Pala Empire and led to the incursion of gold and silver from these countries into Bengal. The powerful Sailendra dynasty, which was Buddhist in faith and which ruled over Malaya, Java, Sumatra and the neighboring islands, sent many embassies to the Pala court and sought permission to build a monastery at Nalanda, and also requested the Pala ruler, Devpala, to endow 5 villages for its upkeep. The request was granted and bears testimony to the close relations between the two empires. The Pratiharas. The Pratiharas who ruled over Kannauj for a long time are also called Gujara Pratiharas. Most scholars considered that they originated from the Gujaras who were pastoralists and fighters, like the Jats. The Pratiharas established a series of principalities in central and eastern Rajasthan. They clashed with the Rashtrakutas for the control of Malwa and Gujarat, and later for Kannauj, which implied control of the upper Ganga valley. The Pratiharas who first had their capital at Greenmill gained prominence under Nagbata I, who offered stout resistance to the Arab rulers of Sindh who were trying to encroach on Rajasthan, Gujarat, the Punjab, etc. The Arabs made a big thrust towards Gujarat but were decisively defeated by the Chalukyan ruler of Gujarat in 738. Although small Arab incursions continued, the Arabs ceased to be a threat thereafter. The efforts of the early Pratihara rulers to extend their control over the upper Ganga valley and Malwa were defeated by the Rashtrakuta rulers Dhruva and Gopal III. In 790 and again in 806-07, the Rashtrakutas defeated the Pratiharas, and then withdrew to the Deccan, leaving the field free for the Palas. Perhaps the main interest of the Rashtrakutas was the domination of Malwa and Gujarat. The real founder of the Pratihara Empire and the greatest ruler of the dynasty was Goja. We do not know much about the early life of Goja, or when he ascended the throne. He rebuilt the empire, and by about AD 836 he had recovered Kannauj, which remained the capital of the Pratihara Empire for almost a century. Goja tried to extend his sway in the east, but he was defeated and checkmated by the Pala ruler, Devpala. He then turned towards central India and the Deccan and Gujarat. This led to a revival of the struggle with the Rashtrakutas. In a sanguinary battle on the bank of the Narmada, Goja was able to retain his control over considerable parts of Malwa and some parts of Gujarat. But he could progress no further in the Deccan. Hence, he turned his attention to the north again. According to an inscription, his territories extended to the western side of the river Sutlej. Arab travelers tell us that the Pratihara rulers had the best cavalry in India. Import of horses from Central Asia and Arabia was an important item of India's trade at that time. Following the death of Devpala and the weakening of the Pala Empire, Goja also extended his empire in the east. The name of Goja is famous in legends. Perhaps, the adventures of Goja in the early part of his life, his gradual reconquest of his lost empire, and his final recovery of Kannauj struck the imagination of his contemporaries. Goja was a devotee of Vishnu, and adopted the title of Adivreh, which has been found inscribed in some of his coins. He is sometimes called Mihir Goja to distinguish him from Goja Paramra of Ujjain, who ruled a little later. Goja probably died in about 885. He was succeeded by his son Mahendrapala I. Mahendrapala, who ruled till about 90809, maintained the empire of Goja and extended it over Magadh and North Bengal. His inscriptions have also been found in Kathiawar, East Punjab and Awadh. Mahendrapala fought a battle with the king of Kashmir but had to yield to him some of the territories in the Punjab won by Goja. The Pratiharas, thus, dominated North India for over 100 years, from the early 9th to the middle of the 10th century. Al-Masudi, a native of Baghdad, who visited Gujarat in 915-16, testifies to the great power and prestige of the Pratihara rulers and the vastness of their empire. He calls the Gujara Pratihara kingdom Al-Juzra, a corrupt form of Gujara, and the king Bora, probably a mispronunciation of Adivreh, the title used by Goja, although Goja had died by that time. Al-Masudi says that the empire of Juzra had 180,000 villages, cities and rural areas and was about 2,000 kilometers in length and 2,000 kilometers in breadth. The king's army had 4 divisions, each consisting of 7 lakhs to 9 lakhs men. With the army of the north he fights against the ruler of Multan and other Muslims who aligned themselves with him. The army of the south fought against the Rashtrakutas, and that of the east against the Palas. He had only 2,000 elephants trained for war, but the best cavalry of any king in the country. The Pratiharas were patrons of learning and literature. The great Sanskrit poet and dramatist, Rajshekhar, lived at the court of Mahipala, a grandson of Goja. The Pratihara also embellished Kannauj with many fine buildings and temples. During the 8th and 9th centuries, many Indian scholars went with embassies to the court of the Caliph at Baghdad. These scholars introduced Indian sciences, especially mathematics, algebra and medicine to the Arab world. We do not know the names of the Indian kings who sent these embassies. The Pratiharas were well known for their hostility to the Arab rulers of Sindh. Despite this, it seems that the movement of scholars and goods between India and West Asia continued even during this period. Between 915 and 918, the Rashtrakuta king, Indra III, again attacked Kannauj and devastated the city. This weakened the Pratihara Empire, and Gujarat probably passed into the hands of the Rashtrakutas, for Al-Masudi tells us that the Pratihara Empire had no access to the sea. The loss of Gujarat, which was the hub of the overseas trade and the main outlet for North Indian goods to West Asian countries, was another blow to the Pratiharas. Another Rashtrakuta ruler, Krishna III, invaded North India in about 963 and defeated the Pratihara ruler. This was followed by the rapid dissolution of the Pratihara Empire. The Rashtrakutas. While the Palas and the Pratiharas were ruling over North India, the Deccan was being ruled by the Rashtrakutas, a remarkable dynasty which produced a long line of warriors and able administrators. The kingdom was founded by Dantidurga, who set up his capital at Manyakhet or Mulke near modern Sholapur. The Rashtrakutas soon dominated the entire area of northern Maharashtra. They also engaged with the Pratiharas for the overlordship of Gujarat and Malwa, as we have seen above. Although their raids did not result in the extension of the Rashtrakuta Empire to the Ganga Valley, they brought rich plunder and added to the fame of the Rashtrakutas. The Rashtrakutas also fought constantly against the eastern Chalukyas of Vengi, in modern Andhra Pradesh, and in the south against the Pallavas of Kachi and the Pandyas of Madurai. Probably the greatest Rashtrakuta rulers were Govinda III, 793814, and Amugvrasha, 814878. After a successful expedition against Nagbata of Kannauj and the annexation of Malwa, Govinda III turned to the south. We are told in an inscription that Govinda terrified the Kerala, Pandya and the Chola kings and caused the Pallavas to wither. The Ganga, of Karnataka, who became dissatisfied through baseness, were bound down with fetters and met with death. The king of Lanka and his minister, who had been negligent of their own interests, were captured and brought over as prisoners to Halpur. 2 statues of the Lord of Lanka were carried to Manyakhet and installed like pillars of victory in front of a Shiva temple. Amugvrasha ruled for 64 years, but by temperament he preferred the pursuit of religion and literature to war. He was himself an author and is credited with writing the first Kannada book on poetics. He was a great builder, and is said to have built the capital city Manyakhet so as to excel the city of Indra. There were many rebellions in the far-flung Rashtrakuta Empire under Amugvrasha. These could be barely contained, and began afresh after his death. His grandson, Indra III, 915927, re-established the empire. After the defeat of Mahipala and the sack of Kannauj in 915, Indra III was the most powerful ruler of his times. According to Al-Masudi, who visited India at that time, the Rashtrakuta king, Balhara or Vallabha Raja, was the greatest king of India, and most of the Indian rulers accepted his suzerainty and respected his envoys. He possessed large armies and innumerable elephants. Krishna III, 934963, was the last in a line of brilliant rulers. He was engaged in a struggle against the Paramaras of Malwa and the eastern Chalukyas of Vengi. He also launched a campaign against the Chola ruler of Tanjore, who had supplanted the Pallavas of Kachi. Krishna III defeated the Chola king, Parantaka I, AD 949, and annexed the northern part of the Chola Empire. He then pressed down to Rameshwaram and set up a pillar of victory there and built a temple. After his death, all his opponents united against his successor. The Rashtrakuta capital, Mulke, was sacked and burnt in 972. This marked the end of the Rashtrakuta Empire. The Rashtrakuta rule in the Deccan thus lasted for almost 200 years, till the end of the 10th century. The Rashtrakuta rulers were tolerant in their religious views and patronized not only Saivism and Vaishnavism but Jainism as well. The famous rock-cut temple of Shiva at Ellora was built by one of the Rashtrakuta kings, Krishna I, in the 9th century. His successor, Amugvrasha, is said to have been a Jain, but he also patronized other faiths. The Rashtrakutas allowed Muslim traders to settle, and permitted Islam to be preached, in their dominions. We are told that the Muslims had their own headman, and had large mosques for their daily prayers in many of the coastal towns in the Rashtrakuta Empire. This tolerant policy helped to promote foreign trade, which enriched the Rashtrakutas. The Rashtrakuta kings were great patrons of arts and letters. In their courts, we find not only Sanskrit scholars, but also poets and others who wrote in Prakrit and in the Apabhramsha, the so-called corrupt languages which were the forerunners of the various modern Indian languages. The great Apabhramsha poet, Swayambhu, and his son probably lived at the Rashtrakuta court. Political ideas and organization. The system of administration in these empires was based on the ideas and practices of the Gupta Empire, Harsha's kingdom in the north, and the Chalukyas in the Deccan. As before, the monarch was the center of all affairs. He was the head of the administration as well as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He sat in a magnificent darbar. Squadrons of infantry and cavalry were stationed in the courtyard. Captured war elephants and horses were paraded before him. He was attended by royal chamberlains, who regulated the coming and going of vassal chiefs, feudatories, ambassadors, and other high officials who regularly waited on the king. The king also dispensed justice. The court was not only a center of political affairs and justice, but cultural life as well. Dancing girls and skilled musicians attended the court. Women of the king's household also attended the darbar on festive occasion. In the Rashtrakuta Empire, according to Arab writers, women did not veil their faces. The king's position was generally hereditary. Thinkers of the time emphasized absolute loyalty and obedience to the king because of the insecurity of the times. Wars were frequent between kings and their vassals. While kings strove to maintain law and order within their kingdoms, their arms rarely extended far enough. Vassal rulers and autonomous chiefs often limited the area of the direct administration of the king, although the kings adopted high-sounding titles such as Maharaj Dhiras Parambataraka etc., and claimed to be Chakravartin, or supreme, of all Indian rulers. A contemporary writer, Meltithi, thinks that it was the right of an individual to bear arms in order to defend himself against thieves and assassins. He also thinks that it was right to oppose an unjust king. Thus, the extreme view of royal rights and privileges, put forward mainly in the Puranas, was not accepted by all the thinkers. The rules about succession were not rigidly fixed. The eldest son often succeeded, but there are many instances when the eldest son had to fight his younger brothers, and sometimes lost to them. Thus, the Rashtrakuta rulers Dhruva and Govinda IV deposed their elder brothers. Sometimes, rulers designated the eldest son or another favorite son as their Yuvraj or successor. In that case, the Yuvraj stayed at the capital and helped in the task of administration. Younger sons were sometimes appointed provincial governors. Princesses were rarely appointed to government posts, but we do have an instance when a Rashtrakuta princess, Chandrabalab, a daughter of Amugrasha I, administered the Raju Doab for some time. Kings were generally advised by a number of ministers. The ministers were chosen by the king, generally from leading families. Their position was often hereditary. Thus, in the case of the Pala kings, we hear that a Brahmana family supplied 4 successive chief ministers to Dharmapala and his successors. In such cases, the minister could become very powerful. Although we hear of a number of departments of the central government, we do not know how many of them were there and how they worked. From epigraphic and literary records, it appears that in almost every kingdom, there was a minister of correspondence which included foreign affairs, a revenue minister, treasurer, chief of the armed forces, senapati, chief justice, and purohita. More than one post could be combined in one person, and perhaps one of the ministers was considered the chief or the leading minister on whom the king leaned more than the others. All the ministers, except the purohita, were expected to lead military campaigns as well when called upon to do so. We also hear of officials of the royal household, Antapur. Since the king was the fountainhead of all power, some of the officers of household became very powerful. The armed forces were very important for the maintenance and expansion of the empire. We have already cited evidence from Arab travelers that the Pala, Pratihara and Rashtrakuta kings had large and well-organized infantry and cavalry, and large number of war elephants. Elephants were supposed to be elements of strength and were greatly prized. The largest number of elephants was maintained by the Pala kings. Large numbers of horses were imported both by Rashtrakuta and Pratihara kings by sea from Arabia and West Asia, and overland from Khorasan, East Persia, and Central Asia. The Pratihara kings are believed to have had the finest cavalry in the country. There are no reference to war chariots which had fallen out of use. Some of the kings, especially the Rashtrakutas, had a large number of forts. They were garrisoned by special troops, and had their own independent commanders. The infantry consisted of regular and irregular troops, and of levies provided by the vassal chiefs. The regular troops were often hereditary and sometimes drawn from different regions all over India. Thus, the Pala infantry consisted of soldiers from Malwa, Kasa, Assam, Lata, South Gujarat, and Karnataka. The Pala kings, and perhaps the Rashtrakutas, had their own navies, but we do not know much about their strength and organization. The empires consisted of area administered directly and areas ruled over by the vassal chiefs. The latter were autonomous as far as their internal affairs were concerned, and had a general obligation of loyalty, paying a fixed tribute and supplying the quota of troops to the overlord. Sometimes, a son of a vassal chief was required to stay in attendance of the overlord to guard against rebellion. The vassal chiefs were required to attend the darbar of the overlord on special occasions, and sometimes they were required to marry one of their daughters to the overlord or to one of his sons. But the vassal chiefs always aspired to be independent and wars between them and the overlord were frequent. Thus, the Rashtrakutas had to fight constantly against the vassal chiefs of Vengi, Andhra, and Karnataka. The Pratiharas had to fight against the Paramaras of Malwa and the Chandelas of Bundelkhand. The directly administered territories in the Pala and Pratihara empires were divided into Gupti, provinces, and Mandala or Vizya, districts. The governor of a province was called Uparika and the head of a district, Vizayapati. The Uparika was expected to collect land revenue and maintain law and order with the help of the army. The Vizayapati was expected to do the same within his jurisdiction. During the period, there was an increase of smaller chieftains, called Samantas or Gogapti, who dominated over a number of villages. The Visayapatis and these smaller chiefs tended to merge with each other, and later on the word Samanta began to be used indiscriminately for both of them. In the Rashtrakuta kingdom, the directly administered areas were divided into Rashtra, provinces, Vizya and Gupti. The head of Rashtra was called Rashtrapati, and he performed the same functions as the Uparika did in the Pala and Pratihara empires. The Vizya was like a modern district, and the Gupti was a smaller unit to it. In the Pala and Pratihara empires, the unit below the Vizya was called Patala. The precise role of these smaller units is not known. It seems that their main purpose was the realization of land revenue and some attention to law and order. Apparently all the officials were paid by giving them grants of rent-free land. This tended to blur the distinction between local officials and the hereditary chiefs and smaller vassals. Similarly, the Rashtrapati or governor sometimes enjoyed the status and title of a vassal king. Below these territorial divisions was the village. The village was the basic unit of administration. The village administration was carried on by the village headman and the village accountant whose posts were generally hereditary. They were paid by grants of rent-free lands. The headman was often helped in his duties by the village elders called Grama Mahajana or Grama Mahatara. In the Rashtrakuta kingdom, particularly in Karnataka, we are told that there were village committees to manage local schools, tanks, temples and roads. They could also receive money or property in trust and manage them. These subcommittees worked in close cooperation with the headman and received a percentage of the revenue collection. Simple disputes were also decided by these committees. Towns had similar committees, to which the heads of trade guilds were also associated. Law and order in the towns and in areas in their immediate vicinity was the responsibility of the Koshtapala or Kotwal, a figure made familiar through many stories. An important feature of the period was the rise in the Deccan of hereditary revenue officers called Nadgundas or Desa Gramkutas. They appear to have discharged the same functions as the Deshmukhs and Deshpandes of later times in Maharashtra. This development, along with the Petri chieftainships in North India which we have just mentioned, had an important bearing on society and politics. As the power of these hereditary elements grew, the village committees became weaker. The central ruler also found it difficult to assert his authority over them and to control them. This is what we mean when we say that the government was becoming feudalized. Another point to bear in mind is the relationship of state and religion during the time. Many of the rulers of that time were devout followers of Shiva or Vishnu, or they followed the teachings of Buddhism or Jainism. They made handsome donations to the Brahmins, or the Buddhist vihars or the Jain temples. But, generally, they gave patronage to all the faiths, and did not persecute anyone for his or her religious beliefs. Muslims were also welcomed and allowed to preach their faith by the Rashtrakuta kings. Normally, a king was not expected to interfere with the customs, or with the code of conduct prescribed by the law books called the Dharmashastras. But he did have the general duty of protecting Brahmins and maintaining the division of society into 4 states or varnas. The Purohita was expected to guide the king in this matter. But it should not be thought that the Purohita interfered with state affairs or dominated the king. Meltitli, the foremost expounder of Dharmashastra in this period, says that the king's authority was derived both from the Dharmashastras, including the Vedas, and from Arthashastra or the science of polity. His public duty or Rajadharma was to be based on the Arthashastra, that is, on principles of politics. This really meant that politics and religion were, in essence, kept apart, religion being essentially a personal duty of the king. Thus, the kings were not dominated by the priests, or by the sacred law expounded by them. Religion was, however, important for legitimizing and strengthening the position of the rulers. Of the rulers therefore built grand temples, often at their capitals, and gave handsome land grants for the maintenance of the temples and to the Brahmins. 3. South India, the Chola Empire. (900 to 1200). Powerful kingdoms had risen in South India during the 6th and 8th centuries. The most important among them were the Pallavas and the Pandyas who dominated modern Tamil Nadu, the Cheras of modern Kerala, and the Chalukyas who dominated the Maharashtra area or the Deccan. It was the Chalukyan king, Pulkesin II, who had defeated Harsha and not allowed him to expand his kingdom towards the Deccan. Some of these kingdoms, such as the Pallava and Pandya, had strong navies. They also played an important role in strengthening economic, religious and cultural relations with the countries of Southeast Asia, and with China. Their navies enabled them to invade and rule some parts of Sri Lanka for some time. The Chola Empire, which arose in the 9th century, brought under its control a large part of the peninsula. The Cholas developed a powerful navy which enabled them to conquer Sri Lanka and the Maldives. Its impact was felt even by the countries of Southeast Asia. The Chola Empire may be said to mark a climax in South Indian history. The rise of the Chola Empire. The founder of the Chola Empire was Vijayalaya, who was at first a feudatory of the Pallavas. He captured Tanjore in AD 850. And by the end of the 9th century, the Cholas had defeated both the Pallavas of Kachi, Tandaimandalam, and weakened the Pandyas, bringing the southern Tamil country under their control. But the Cholas were hard put to defend their position against the Rashtrakutas. As we have noted in a previous chapter, Krishna III defeated the Chola king and annexed the northern part of the Chola Empire. This was a serious setback to the Cholas, but they rapidly recovered, particularly after the death of Krishna III in 965 and the downfall of the Rashtrakuta Empire. Age of Rajraja and Rajendra I. The greatest Chola rulers were Rajraja, 985-1014, and his son Rajendra I, 1014-1044. Rajraja destroyed the Chera navy at Trivandrum and attacked Quilon. He then conquered Madurai and captured the Pandyan king. He also invaded Sri Lanka and annexed its northern part to his empire. These moves were partly motivated by his desire to bring the trade with the Southeast Asian countries under his control. The Coromandel coast and Malabar were the centers for India's trade with the countries of Southeast Asia. One of his naval exploits was the conquest of the Maldives. Rajraja annexed the northwestern parts of the Ganga kingdom in Karnataka and overran Vendi. Rajendra had been appointed heir apparent in his father's lifetime and had considerable experience in administration and warfare before his accession to the throne. He carried forward the annexationist policy of Rajraja by completely overrunning the Pandya and Chera countries and including them in his empire. The conquest of Sri Lanka was also completed, with the crown and royal insignia of the king and the queen of Sri Lanka being captured in a battle. Sri Lanka was not able to free herself from the Chola control for another 50 years. Rajraja and Rajendra I marked their victories by erecting a number of Shiva and Vishnu temples at various places. The most famous of these was the Brihadishwara temple at Tanjore, which was completed in 1010. The Chola rulers adopted the practice of having inscriptions written on the walls of these temples, giving a historical narrative of their victories. That is why we know a great deal more about the Cholas than their predecessors. One of the most remarkable exploits in the reign of Rajendra I was the march across Kalinga to Bengal, in which the Chola armies crossed the river Ganga and defeated two local kings. This expedition, which was led by a Chola general, took place in 1022 and followed in reverse the same route which the great conqueror Samudragupta had followed. To commemorate this occasion, Rajendra I assumed the title of Gangaikondakola, the Chola who conquered the Ganga. He built a new capital near the mouth of the Kaveri river and called it Gangaikondakolapuram, the city of the Chola who conquered the Ganga. An even more remarkable exploit in the time of Rajendra I were the naval expeditions against the revived Sri Vijaya Empire. The Sri Vijaya Empire, which had been revived in the 10th century, extended over the Malay Peninsula, Sumatra, Java and the neighbouring islands, and controlled the overseas trade route to China. The rulers of the Sailendra dynasty of the Sri Vijaya kingdom were Buddhists and had cordial relations with the Cholas. The Sailendra ruler had built a Buddhist monastery at Nagpatnam and, at his instance, Rajendra I had endowed a village for its upkeep. The cause of the breach between the two apparently was the Chola eagerness to remove obstacles to Indian traders, and to expand trade with China. The expeditions led to the conquest of Kadaram or Kalah and a number of other places in the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra. The Chola navy was the strongest in the area, and for some time the Bay of Bengal was converted into a Chola lake. The Chola rulers also sent a number of embassies to China. These were partly diplomatic and partly commercial. Chola embassies reached China in 1016 and 1033. A Chola embassy of 70 merchants reached China in 1077 and, according to a Chinese account, received 81,800 strings of copper cash, that is, more than 4 lakhs of rupees in return for the articles of tribute, comprising glassware, camphor, brocades, rhinoceros horns, ivory, etc. Tribute was the word used by the Chinese for all articles brought for trade. The Chola rulers fought constantly with the Chalukyas who had succeeded the Rashtrakutas. These are called the later Chalukyas and their capital was at Kalyani. The Cholas and the later Chalukyas clashed for the overlordship of Vendi, Rayalasima, the Tungabhadra Doab, and the Ganga-ruled country in northwest Karnataka. Neither side was able to gain a decisive victory in this contest and ultimately it exhausted both the kingdoms. It also appears that the wars were becoming harsher during this time. The Chola rulers sacked and plundered Chalukyan cities including Kalyani, and massacred the people, including Brahmins and children. They adopted a similar policy in the Pandya country, settling military colonies to overawe the population. They destroyed Anuradhapura, the ancient capital of the rulers of Sri Lanka, and treated their king and queen harshly. The say are blots in the history of the Chola Empire. However, once they had conquered a country, the Cholas tried to set up a sound system of administration in it. One of the remarkable features of the Chola administration was their encouragement to local self-government in the villages all over their empire. The Chola Empire continued to flourish during the 12th century, but it declined during the early part of the 13th century. The later Chalukyan Empire in the Maharashtra area had also come to an end during the 12th century. The place of the Cholas was taken by the Pandyas and the Hoyslas in the south, and the later Chalukyas were replaced by the Yadavas and the Kakatiyas. All these states extended patronage to arts and architecture. Unfortunately, they weakened themselves by continually fighting against each other, sacking the towns and not even sparing the temples. Ultimately, they were destroyed by the sultans of Delhi at the beginning of the 14th century. Chola government, local self-government. The king was the most important person in the Chola administration. All authority rested in his hands, but he had a council of ministers to advise him. The king often went on tours in order to oversee the administration. The Cholas maintained a large army consisting of elephants, cavalry and infantry, which were called the three limbs of the army. The infantry was generally armed with spears. Most of the kings had bodyguards who were sworn to defend the kings even at the cost of their lives. The Venetian traveller, Marco Polo, who visited Kerala in the 13th century, says that all the soldiers who were bodyguards burnt themselves in the funeral pyre of the monarch when he died, a statement which may well be an exaggeration. The Cholas also had a strong navy, as we have seen, which dominated the Malabar and Coromandel coast and, for some time, the entire Bay of Bengal. The Chola state included area of central control, and loosely administered areas under different types of local control. The state was interspersed with hill people and Tiavan Bils. The basic unit of administration was the Nadu, which consisted of a number of villages having close kinship ties and other close associations. The number of Nadus increased as fresh lands were brought under cultivation by means of irrigation works such as ponds, wells, etc., and by converting hill or tribal people into agriculturists. Grants to Brahmins and temples increased, both of which helped in expanding cultivation. In the Chola kingdom, Nadus were grouped into Valnadas. The Chola state was divided into 4 mandalams or provinces. Sometimes, princes of the royal family were appointed governors of provinces. Officials were generally paid by giving them assignments of revenue-bearing lands. The Chola rulers built a network of royal roads which were useful for trade as well as for the movement of the army. Trade and commerce flourished in the Chola Empire, and there were some gigantic trade guilds which traded with Java and Sumatra. The Cholas also paid attention to irrigation. The river Kaveri and other rivers were used for the purpose. Many tanks for irrigation were built. Some of the Chola rulers carried out an elaborate survey of land in order to fix the government's share of the land revenue. We do not know what precisely the government's share was. In addition to land tax, drew their income from tolls on trade, taxes on professions, and also from the plunder of the neighboring territories. The Chola rulers were wealthy, and could afford to build a number of towns and magnificent monuments, including temples. We have already referred to local self-government in the villages in some areas in the Rashtrakuta Empire. We know more about village government in the Chola Empire from a number of inscriptions. We hear of 2 assemblies, called the Ur and the Sabha or Mahasabha. The Ur was a general assembly of the village. However, we know more about the working of the Mahasabha. This was a gathering of the adult men in the Brahman villages which were called agraharans. These were villages with Brahman settlements in which most of the land was rent-free. These villages enjoyed a large measure of autonomy. The affairs of the village were managed by an executive committee to which educated persons owning property were elected either by drawing lots or by rotation. These members had to retire every 3 years. There were other committees for helping in the assessment and collection of land revenue, for maintenance of law and order, justice, etc. One of the important committees was the Tank Committee, which looked after the distribution of water to the fields. The Mahasabha could distribute new lands and exercise ownership rights over them. It could also raise loans for the village and levy taxes. The self-government enjoyed by these Chola villages was a very fine system. To some extent, this system worked in the other villages as well. However, the growth of feudalism, which is discussed in an earlier chapter, restricted their autonomy. Cultural life. The Chola rule saw the further growth and climax of the Bhakti movement. The Chola rule saw the further growth and climax of the Bhakti movement, which we have discussed separately. The movement was closely linked to temples. The extent and resources of the Chola Empire enabled the rulers to build great capitals, such as Tanjore, Gangaikonda Kolapuram, Kachi, etc. The rulers maintained large households and large palaces with banquet halls, spacious gardens and terraces. Thus, we learn of 7 or 5-storied houses for their chiefs. Unfortunately, none of the palaces of the period have survived. The Chola capital, Gangaikonda is now just a small village near Tanjore. However, descriptions of the magnificent palaces of the rulers and their ministers, and of equally magnificent houses in which the wealthy merchants lived, are to be found in the literature of the period. Temple architecture in the south attained its climax under the Cholas. The style of architecture which came into vogue during this period is called Dravida, because it was confined largely to South India. The main feature of this style was the building of many stories above the Garbhagriha, the innermost chamber where the chief deity resides. The number of stories varied from 5 to 7, and they had a typical style which came to be called the Vimana. A pillared hall called mandap, with elaborately carved pillars and a flat roof, was generally placed in front of the sanctum. It acted as an audience hall and was a place for various other activities such as ceremonial dances which were performed by the Devdasis, the women dedicated to the service of the gods. Sometimes, a passage ran around the sanctum so that the devotees could go round it. Images of many other gods could be put in this passage. This entire structure was enclosed in a courtyard surrounded by high walls, which were pierced by lofty gates called gopurams. In course of time, the vimanas rose higher and higher, the number of courtyards were increased to 2 or 3, and the gopurams also became more and more elaborate. Thus the temple became a miniature city or a palace, with living rooms for priests and many others being provided in it. The temples generally enjoyed revenue-free grants of lands for their expenses. They also received grants and rich donations from the wealthy merchants. Some of the temples became so rich that they entered business, lent money, and took part in business enterprises. They also spent money on improving cultivation, digging tanks, wells, etc., and providing irrigation channels. An early example of the Dravida style of temple architecture is the 8th. An early example of the Dravida style of temple architecture is the 8th century temple of Kailasnath at Kachipuram. One of the finest and most elaborate examples of the style is, however, provided by the Brihadiswara temple at Tanjore built by Rajaraja I. This is also called the Rajaraja temple because the Cholas were in the habit of installing images of kings and queens in the courtyards of the temples. The temple at Gangaikonda, though in a dilapidated condition, is another fine example of temple architecture under the Cholas. A large number of temples were also built at other places in South India. However, it may be well to remember that the proceeds for some of these activities were obtained from the plunder of the population of the neighboring areas by the Chola rulers. After the fall of the Cholas, temple building activity continued under the Chalukyas of Kalyani and the Hoyslas. The district of Garhwad and the Hoysla capital, Halebid, had a large number of temples. The most magnificent of these is the Hoysaleswara temple. It is the best example of what is called the Chalukyan style. Apart from the images of gods and their attendants, both men and women, yaks and yakshini, the temples contain finely sculptured panels which show a busy panorama of life, including dance, music and scenes of war and love. Thus, life was closely integrated with religion. For the common man, the temples were not merely a place for worship but the hub of social and cultural life as well. The art of sculpture attained a high standard in South India during this period. One example of this was the giant statue of Gometswara at Shravana Bilgola. Another aspect was image making which reached its zenith in the dancing figure of the Shiva, called Natraja. The Natraja figures of this period, particularly those in bronze, are considered masterpieces. Many fine examples of this are to be found in museums in India and abroad. The rulers of the various dynasties also patronized arts and letters during this period. While Sanskrit was regarded as the language of high culture and a number of kings as well as scholars and court poets wrote in it, a remarkable feature of the period was the growth of literature in the local languages of India. A number of popular saints called Nayanmars and Alvars who were devotees of Shiva and Vishnu respectively, flourished in the Tamil kingdoms between the 6th and the 9th centuries. They composed their works in Tamil. The writings of the Savite saints, which were collected into 11 volumes under the name Tirumurai in the early part of the 12th century, are considered sacred and are looked upon as the 5th Veda. The age of Kamban, who is placed in the second half of the 11th and the early part of the 12th century, is regarded as a golden age in Tamil literature. Kamban's Ramayana is considered a classic in Tamil literature. Kamban is believed to have lived at the court of a Chola king. Many others too took their themes from the Ramayana and Mahabharata, thus bringing these classics nearer to the people. Though younger than Tamil, Kannada also became a literary language during this period. The Rashtrakuta, the Chalukya and the Hoysala rulers patronized Kannada as well as Telugu. The Rashtrakuta king, Amugrasha, wrote a book on poetics in Kannada. Many Jain scholars also contributed to the growth of Kannada. Pampa, Ponna and Ranna are regarded as the 3 gems of Kannada poetry. Although they were under the influence of Jainism, they also wrote on themes taken from the Ramayana and Mahabharata. Nannaya, who lived at the court of a Chalukyan king, began the Telugu version of the Mahabharata. The work begun by him was completed in the 13th century by Tikkanna. Like the Tamil Ramayana, the Telugu Mahabharata is a classic which inspired many subsequent writers. Many folk or popular themes are also to be found in these literatures. Popular themes which were not derived from Sanskrit and which reflect popular sentiments and emotions are called desi or rural in Telugu. We can, thus, see that the period from the 8th to the 12th century was not only remarkable for the growth of regional kingdoms and regional integration, but was also a period of cultural growth, and the development of trade and commerce and agriculture in South India. Merchants and artisans increased their strength with the development of foreign trade under the Cholas. 4. Economic and social life, education and religious beliefs.